Welcome back to Poetry in Process. Maybe that's the name I'll give these things. The poem that I'm going to be working on in this video is going to focus around the idea of Chekhov's gun. It's a very famous premise. To summarize it, and the quote that I've heard is that if you place a gun on stage in the first act, it has to go off by the second. So it deals with consequential storytelling, relevant details, and I thought that that would be an interesting way to trace these three instances of guns being involved in both memory and in personal history. So this is a semi-chronological story, so as things progress, it begins first in Act 1 with the youngest instance, where the two boys, or at least from the perspective of the narrator, are enlisted to protect these fields of grass that are growing from seeds. And so Act 2 will progress to a later scene, and Act 3 to come even later than that. But form is the difficult thing. But since this one was bound to that idea of Chekhov's gun, I figured it would be worth attempting to write this poem in acts, because it sets up expectations for the reader that can later be subverted. And that'll make for a more interesting poem, I'm hoping. Now, most of the poetry that I deal with is narrative, right? Storytelling embedded with dense images, unique phrasing, and that's where I find a lot of my poetry profits. And so in this one, it is a sense of narrative that's attached to it. And I initially titled the poem "I'm Tired of People Mispronouncing Chekhov," because it's more of an H than a K, but it also doubled as an idea of the expectations that Chekhov sets up, according to his rule, being subverted later on in the poem. But by the end, after revisions and peer review, I decided that Chekhov's gun was a better title in total. So I went ahead and waited about a week before finishing the second portion of this to let it grow, to let it sort of marinate, ideas to develop. And that can be a very useful tool. Typically, I like to go on walks as a way of peripateticism, of activating the brain while you're thinking about ideas, and that's where the vast majority of this poem came from. It was having started it, waiting, and then looking back to develop. I'll do that in the drafting phase as well. Now, one of the things that I try to attain in my poetry to make it worth reading is in unique phrasing. So I try to say things differently, and as I say them differently, then typically new connections are drawn, because pretty much all language is association, all learning is by association. And so when we phrase things differently, we have a better opportunity to discover things. And a lot of poetry is discovery, at least to me. Like in this first line where I say, "My father, seed sower," which has a double meaning, especially in the context of the rest of the collection, where his faith is so important to him. So seed sower has a doubled play on words there. And later on in the poem, I'll use the term deep south cousin, almost as a title, but it becomes a character in and of itself. So unique phrasing is vital to me. Second off, I like to use benchmarks. So anaphora is the term that's typically given in poetry writing circles, right? So if you wanted to be able to speak the language, then anaphora is the term to do it, which is the repetition of phrases. I like to call them benchmarks, right? Something for the reader to hook onto. So in this poem, it's ideas of the bullets lodging themselves, or the idea of a headshot, these recurrent images and specific phrasing that can draw the reader's eye from the first act and the second act all the way to the third, to make that ending that much more impactful. So moving from the first to the second, I retain those ideas until it lands in the third, in which the bullet lodges in her brain, in Jordan's brain. And it was an interesting thing for me to learn that her name was Jordan, because it works well within the context of the collection. So, without further ado, that is Chekhov's gun. Act 1. Pellet. My father, seed sower, enlists us to shoot pigeons as they steal grass. Our perch is the second floor balcony, and we take shifts, firing at small birds eating. The metal beads are too dull to kill. Instead, they lodge themselves beneath the wings, and you can tell a good shot when the bird stumbles, wobbling into the air. Unlike playing war, there is the unmistakable joy of impact. We keep score, defend the killing fields, and the grass grows green. Act 2. Bullet. My deep south cousin gifts his sons shotguns at age 5, a rite of passage. He takes me hunting when I tell him I've never mounted a kill. He lays walnuts on the ground in vague deer shape, explaining that a headshot ruins everything. He points to the crack between the breast and shoulder, to the heart walnut. A bullet there will leave a blood trail, preserve the head unspoiled. A young buck lingers at the business end of my rifle. Time stops, and I freeze too when it looks at me. It flees, and I learn a gun rarely goes off when you expect. Act 3. Shard. I'm grown and living by myself, my only home defense a yard sale samurai sword. Through my window a car is being rekeyed, but the owner refuses, reaches into the boot of his Charger and removes an assault rifle. He fires into the crowd 6 times, missing each shot, and runs into the woods. Everyone is thankful to be alive, until they're screaming in the distance. Jordan was 9 years old, washing dishes, when a bullet struck through the wall and lodged itself in her forehead.